Montessori Europe webinar. It is a delight to see so many of you returning to our conversations. I would like to welcome Lynnette Brock from Schema Play, who will share with us her research into Piagetian schemas and explore how different these are from the operational activities that children do when they are developing their patterns of behavior, which we often see in the operational schemes, such as transporting, trajectory, containment, and things like that. So it promises to be an exciting session and opportunity for us to really think about how Montessori engages with some of the Piagetian ideas or vice versa, or Piaget engaged with Montessori's principles. For everybody who is attending, just to remind you that we are recording, but after Lynnette's presentation, we will break into breakout rooms. You will have facilitators who will guide you through the conversation, who will also feed back to the group in the same way as we have done before. And if you are a paid-up member of Montessori Europe, you can ask for a certificate of attendance, but you will need to complete a questionnaire at the end of the session. So thank you, Wendeling, for looking after the technical elements of our conversations. Please stay mute during Lynnette's presentation, and I will hand over to Lynnette Brock, Montessori colleague and researcher and person committed to sustainability and the whole idea of looking after the environment and growing in our awareness of how to look after the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Barbara and Wendelin, for setting this up this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you. I'm just going to share a screen with you. So just for a moment, you're going to just see a blue screen coming up in a moment. And hopefully that will all work fine. And we can, hopefully, you will see a PowerPoint. There, can we all see a PowerPoint? Excellent. So today's session, we're looking at schema play. We're looking at a distinction between a scheme and a schema, and why do we even need to know about this? And we're also looking at emergent learning. So what is it? It's quite a big topic to get over in 20 minutes, but we'll give it our best shot. Thinking about emergence, how best can we understand this? Well, I decided to take a water molecule to try and help us understand this. Hydrogen isn't wet. Oxygen isn't wet either. But when they came together, something very creative happened. And they created this amazing stuff called water. So the quality of water are formed from these two prerequisites. And it's a creative thing that's happened. They've come together and we no longer have hydrogen or oxygen. We've got water. And that's what emergence is all about. It's two things coming together to create something else. And we'll have a look at that as we go through some case studies in a moment. But before we do that, I really wanted us to think about, how do we learn? How do we actually come to understand what things are? And I've chosen a couple of objects here. Now, two of them, I think you're all looking at and thinking, I know what they are. One of them, I'm hoping you don't. Some of you may have done some training with me before, so if so, could you shh for a moment? But there is an object in blue there, and I just wondered if you know what it is. I've got one here. It might not show too well in the camera, but this one's wooden, and this is one end of it, and this is another end of it. And I don't know if anybody's got any ideas of what that might be. Oh, there's something coming through in the chat. Any ideas? Has anybody seen one before? Well, I'll give you the name. It's a netting needle. Does that help any more? Possibly. And the reason it possibly helps is we've come across a needle before, and we probably know what a net is. So we can imagine probably what a netting needle does, because we've already had experience of needles and possibly nets. So what's the point I'm trying to make here? Well, any object, whether it be the pen I'm holding here or the netting needle, how we understand any object or phenomenon or image is by their action possibilities, what you can do with them. What are the operations? Now, this is really important because we're getting a lot of research now on embodied education, embodied cognition. And what we need to understand is every golden nugget of knowledge has two parts. It has both a schema and a scheme. Now, why is this important? If I asked you to think about a bus right now, you're going to draw from your memory an image. I'm thinking, because of my experiences, a London red bus that you hop on at the back. And I'm also thinking of what a bus is for, that it transports people, it takes people from one place to another. If we think of a van, we immediately think of what its operation is, that it contains things and transports things. This is how we perceive, this is how we understand things, this is how our memory recall works. It's by our bodily experience of what we've seen and what we've done and what we've experienced ourselves. We never perceive the same thing as the person next to us. I remember someone once saying to me, "Don't you see it?" And I really couldn't, and they got very frustrated with me. Let's have a look at that in more detail. Here's a baby. A baby sees a ladder, but they don't. They have no idea that that's a ladder or what a ladder's for. They perceive that ladder in terms of its affordances, what they can do with it, or what it can do for them. So for a small baby, it's going to be to hold on to and pull themselves up. However, other people in the environment are going to have a different perception of it. This lady has been up a ladder. She's seen a ladder in use. She knows that firefighters use a ladder. She perceives a ladder. But other agents in the environment will perceive it for different things. Perhaps they've used something like this in a gym. But the more opportunities they have of seeing things and seeing them in use, the better they become able to understand it. So environmental affordances are determined by both the environment and the agent, the experiences that the person has had. Let's take that familiar activity, transferring with a spoon. For a very young child who maybe hasn't seen any of these before, what are they going to perceive about this activity? There's two objects there that look the same, but one has got something in it. There's also an object there that's on its own, and it looks different to the other things. Now, in a Montessori environment, we say something like, "Anna, I thought today you might like to do a new activity with me. It's called transferring with a spoon. Shall we have a look at it?" Boom, there we go. Transferring is the scheme. Spoon is the schema, the figurative impression of the spoon. And now we know what you do with it. Only we don't, because we're little and we don't understand what really has just been said to us, but it's great that we've labelled it. What the child picks up, though, is when we model it, when we introduce it to the child, and when the child hopefully engages in it themselves. So how they come to understand a bowl and a spoon, they've got the figurative knowledge and also the schemes that enable them to understand them. The spoon affordance can be to transfer something, and the bowls are containers. We can contain them. Now, bowls are really important, more important than I ever thought. In fact, any container is quite important. When we're very young, from the moment we're conceived, really, we're contained. We're contained in a womb. We're contained in a cot, in a pram, in a pushchair, in a car seat. So, of course, the moment we can get out and about and we're moving, we want to see how other things can be contained. How does this containing work? So what we have is we've got a bowl, but the child doesn't understand it as a bowl yet. It's just something you can put something in. So they're applying a containing scheme. And what they're exploring is the inside, the outside, and the boundary between the two. Now, this is more important than we ever thought. And it's really got me thinking about the materials that we have in our Montessori environment, because there's a lot of containing that goes on. Because what we've found is containers are actually the conceptual primitives or grounded metaphors of classes. What do I mean by that? Seeing sets. When we have two objects, perhaps that add up, 5 and 4, we need to be able to contain them to see that they're two different things to be pulled together. So containing is a prerequisite scheme and a very important one to later numeracy. So if we think about it, our activities of everyday life or practical life and our sensorial and many activities across the curriculum in the Montessori environment offer containing. So this is fantastic. And what happens is, although the child doesn't know it as a bowl yet, the more experience they have of containing in different ways, using water play, boxes, crates in supermarket play, buckets in sand play, pots and pans in role play, they become aware that other objects also have the affordance of being a container, that they can do containing. And this is when they categorize and they start to differentiate between objects. And of course, this is part of problem solving. Oh, I need a wheelbarrow to move the leaves and I need a bag to go shopping. Let's have a look at the knob cylinder block. I remember, sorry to mention this, Barbara, but I remember being interviewed at the college as a student to come and do the course. And on the coffee table in this little room at the front of the college was a knob cylinder block. And I was waiting for Barbara to come in and I was very nervous about going for the interview. And I thought, what is that thing on the table? And I actually wanted to have a look at it to see, but I didn't dare because I was going to be interviewed. But I noticed there was a book next to it that had a picture of it. And I thought, I've got to get this book to know what it is. It's really interesting. We perceive the knob cylinders because we know them very well. I thought maybe they were weights because they look very similar to something I've seen before that's a weight. So how do we understand it and how does the child come to understand what this knob cylinder block is? It's by the schemes, by what they can do with it. It's a container. We might not have appreciated that before. The sockets are containers. The child is exploring volume, not only dimension and perception visually. There's actually a volume there because we've got the sockets. We're sorting and potentially grading. So schemes are really important. They are the anchors to all our understanding and all our complex operations, such as reading, writing, subtracting, and measuring. Now, I've got some examples here because some of you may not have come across them before. Chris Athy, in her research with the Frubel Institute, and her classroom teacher, Tina Bruce, who some of you may be very aware of, documented all the operational schemes that children use. And they indexed them and they thought about how they could support their children's play even more by offering them new context to apply them in. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, hang on a moment. I know you've just done the scheme and schema distinction, but why is everybody writing about schema in the UK books? Well, it's very interesting. And Chris Athy picked upon this herself. When she was finishing the Frubel research writing, she actually put a note at the end to say that she'd become aware of this distinction that Piaget had made, but the writing was already done, the research was already concluded. So for now, they would stick with the word schema for both a figurative impression and an operation. But she said it was worthy of exploration. And actually, she stated in her book in 1990, Extending Thought in Young Children, Piaget makes it clear that schemes refer to real operational systems of knowledge and schemas refer to figurative knowledge. And she went on to say, if we understand this and how it works, we could probably better support children right through education. Now, Piaget was frustrated about this English translation because it didn't help embodied education. We only had one thing for mental and operational. And the way I got into really researching this was it was actually a student at the Montessori College when I was teaching child development. He said, hang on a moment, are you telling me a scheme is a mental thing and an operation? And I thought, very good point. I am, yes, but is it correct? So is it enough just to identify a scheme, an operation? And what do we do with the information when we have? And what about developing new schemes? How do we build upon them? How do we use them as an anchor to support new? And how do we support new schemas, new figurative knowledge? Well, Montessori understood this very well. I think she never wrote about it in these terms, but I think she had a good perception of that every golden nugget of knowledge has two parts. She certainly talked about children needing to use their schemes, their aptitudes, she referred to them as, to build upon them and develop competences in them. And we can see that in the sequencing of the Montessori materials. And she also said, one of the greatest mistakes of our day is to think of movement by itself as something apart from the higher functions. And if you think about it, what we know about memory recall, everything we recall is not a picture in our mind like we might have been taught years ago. That's an old Descartes understanding, which unfortunately has crippled education for many years. It's our body recall, because our mirror neurons fire up. Don't have time to go into that today, but it's our recall and operation and an image that comes together that helps us remember things. So it's really important that we have this distinction. Let's have a look at Oliver. Oliver was in a nursery school, and he was new to the school, and his practitioner was doing a weighing activity with a small group of children. She didn't know much about Oliver's competencies yet. His mother and father were Polish. They were new to the setting. So they shared pictures with her. But what came really apparent to her was, whilst she was doing this weighing activity, Oliver was engaged in his own theme of play, and he was putting things in containers. So she thought about this. I've got a child that's really into containing. So she thinks about fostering and supporting containing with small resources around the environment. But his mother had shared a picture of a popcorn seller with her. And Oliver kept pointing to it and nodding and smiling about it. And so she thought, he really seems to have a schema, figurative impression of what a popcorn seller is. And he seems to understand what a popcorn seller is by what he does, that he sells popcorn. So a popcorn seller contains things. And since this was his anchor, she thought she'd set up a popcorn selling role play theme. So she set up small, medium and large cones. The reason being was he was very competent at containing, had contained in a lot of different ways across the continuous provision, and she wanted to extend it out. So a bit like our Montessori materials are always building upon those anchors. And so she was introducing small, medium and large. So he was sorting and he was grading them, but he was also exchanging, because the children came to pay 1 token for a small popcorn, 2 for a medium size and 3 for a large. So this was also helping his social relationship, because he wasn't really playing with any other children yet and he was new. So it was a really good way in. Over the weeks that followed, and it went on for many weeks, and eventually the head teacher said, we haven't got any more popcorn. So his practitioner thought, where can I go with this? So they had a breakfast club at the setting. So she asked the chef if Oliver could take over making the milkshakes. And he made small milkshakes and large milkshakes. And the little girl standing up there, she was taking orders because she could count and she could tally. Now, Oliver was also counting because he was taking the tokens from his friends, 1 for a small, 2 for medium. So he was really getting into counting. And his friend kept giving him a chitty, and she'd draw a long line if it was for a big milkshake and a short line if it was for a small. And he'd make up the drinks and then she would serve them. After many weeks that followed, he said, I want to do that now. So they switched, and he became a recorder as well. So learning through the imitation. Now, Oliver was fully immersed in his play, and this is what's really important. So free flow play, flow originally came from a researcher called Csikszentmihalyi. Some of you may be very familiar with Csikszentmihalyi because he writes in the NAMTA Montessori journals with Kevin Rotund a lot about flow and starting to engage in the dialogue around embodied cognition as well. And Csikszentmihalyi found in 1975 that elite athletes, when he spoke to them, he said, you know, when it all came together for you and you did that backflip goal across your head, or when it all came together for you on the ice rink and you did that amazing performance, what was it like? And they all said, oh, it was amazing. I just felt like everything I could do came together and I was being pulled along like a flow of water. So he said, so you felt kind of like you were in flow? And they said, yeah, absolutely. It just, at that moment in a creative act, all came together. And that's what it's like when we start to pull our schemes together and combine them. We start to, if we prepare the environment and we enable that time and space like the Montessori work cycle does, we can actually get into flow. Now, for Oliver's journey, he started as a container and he was just juggling one scheme. And for very young children, babies, that's quite a juggle for them. That's a challenge for them initially. And then as they have more experiences and things are offered to them, they start to juggle more. And in Oliver's scheme, he started to be able to juggle containing and sorting, and in fact was grading and counting. So he was really able to get into that play. And as time went on, he was juggling even more schemes and combining them. So he was actually able to take that role play really well. He was containing, sorting, grading, counting, tallying, and recording, all in a very short time, period of around 8 weeks. But what's really important for us to understand here is this combining of schemes, or chunking, as they're commonly called in research now, is our working memory. We can hold, as adults, we hold about 8 schemes. We juggle about 8 schemes at a time. They say it's somewhere between 5 and 7 that we do at any one time. And if you think of complex operations like adding, subtracting, measuring, decoding words, we're doing this all the time. They're broken down into component parts. And when we get very fluent at it, they chunk together, it becomes internalized. And this is the same when we learn to drive. And we're taking those life and death decisions as we're driving along. We've had so much experience of it, it's become internalized. All the schemes have chunked. But when we're new to driving, everything feels a bit separate and it's a bit overwhelming. Now, what's really important about Oliver, and the reason why I chose Oliver to share with you today, was because of this containing that he was so engaged in at the start. So he'd had lots of experiences across the environment with different things, containing shapes, containing balls, getting a real idea of volume, space, measure. But he also, over a few days before we carried out our last observation of him, started drawing circles and putting small world animals in them, sometimes by animal sets. And his practitioner said, "Come, you've got to come quickly. He's been doing this for a couple of days and I don't know where to go next." And what he'd done is he'd put some pigs in one circle and he had some cows in another. And the cows were 4, the pigs were 3, and he counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And she said, "Look, he's made his own container. He's put them in circles." And she was fascinated by this. And she said, "Where do I go? He's not even 5. Should I introduce him to the addition sign?" And we said, "Yes, never put a glass ceiling on. He's there. Just go with it." But what's not been really appreciated before, there's been some books, some research has given ideas of progression, but not really considered it in terms of emergence. And what we now know, if we think about Oliver here, he started with a containing scheme. He then started to contain and sort and grade. So he started to become a measurer in his popcorn play, selling a small one, a medium one, and a large one. And over time, with more experiences, so he started to be able to grade other items, such as the pink tower, he starts to juggle and combine more schemes to problem solve in different ways. But what is very important here to get across is we can have all those prerequisite schemes, and it doesn't mean that the child will pull them together and be able to measure. So an emergent curriculum, as John and I wrote in 2016, recognises that the sophisticated cognitive operations that emerge in children, so their schemes and their complex operations, such as reading, writing, measuring, are irreducible to their component parts, which nevertheless act as developmental precursors that must be drawn together in a child's mind. So what we're saying here is the child could have engaged in all of these, but it's only if they're motivated, only if they see a reason for doing it, that they will pull it together. And in Oliver's case, it was the popcorn seller that had given him that motivation. And if we have a look at addition, again, we're very aware of the schemes that support children in additions, containing, matching, counting, tallying, recording, grading. But again, it's only when the child will be motivated to do so that they'll pull those schemes together. And you may have often heard a mum say, "Oh, I can't understand it. My first daughter was reading at 4 and my younger one doesn't." Well, A, it will be the motivation, and B, it will be the experiences that we've had. And as I said earlier, we all perceive things differently to one another, depending upon our experiences. So what does this mean? Well, it means if we look at children's schemes, what they're applying when they're using, say, the Montessori materials, it's enabling us, it's another tool for seeing how we can support child-centered learning to truly follow the child. And what we are doing is we're building upon what a child can do and what they know. And hopefully, oops, sorry, can't drive, the child is pulling the curriculum along, which is what we want to do in Montessori, rather than the curriculum being a tick list and pulling the child. So it's really important that we really drill down in our observations and see what the children are doing. And I believe we're about to go into a breakout. So I've got a big request of everyone. I've got a question that I'd like to pose. We've got three Montessori materials here that I hope everyone is very familiar with. We've got transferring with the tongue, we've got colour box 1, and we've got the long rods or long red rods. I'd like you to think about what schemes are children applying when they use them. Now, a scheme is any doing thing, okay? Any doing thing. When we went to the Frugal Archives, there were index boxes, lots of them. It is a doing thing, and it's often shown as a repeated behaviour. So what is the child doing when they're engaging with those materials? Once you've ascertained that, I would really love you to think about how can I enable those schemes to be applied in different contexts that are not Montessori materials. So in the outdoor environment, maybe in the forest, maybe on a beach. And you could even think, if you've got time, about sustainability. Could they use those schemes in thinking about protecting wildlife, or in reduction, or reusing? Are there other opportunities, thinking about cosmic education, for these schemes to be applied? Thank you ever so much.
Welcome back to the main room, Zoom room. I think we are now ready to share the discussions in our breakout rooms. Lynnette has set us quite specific tasks, and it was interesting to follow how the discussions have unfolded. So may I invite Suzanne and Heidi to share first, please.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Suzanne goes, right, you're up, Heidi. Well, first I said, please not us first. Please not us first.
I'm so sorry. Well, would you like to ponder for a moment? Shall I pass it to Michelle and Jarek?
No, we can start. It's okay. We're fine. So I think that one of the interesting things that we discussed in our group was just trying to unpack the schemes and figure out, for example, what was the difference between transferring and transporting, for example, because we found that that was something that we could link to all of the activities because we were transferring things from the shelf to the mat or to the table. But was there transporting as well? And what, are there subtle differences between them? So I think that this maybe elicited more questions than answers for us. But it was an interesting exercise to just look at each activity separately and see where the similarities in the schemes were and where there were some differences, and maybe Suzanne can just give a quick précis on the going out or indoor-outdoor exercises.
I think one of the other things that we also were talking about quite a bit, we had a few people in our group that weren't Montessorian, so they didn't necessarily know, what the materials were for and how that works. So that was really interesting because they just looked at the materials and gave us sort of, what they thought the child could learn from those materials as well, which was interesting. And it made me think a little bit about, as Montessorians, we're so focused on the direct objective of the activities that we sometimes don't realize the value of all the other indirect possible learning that the child is getting from that material. So that was great. And then we had quite a bit in terms of going outdoors, whether it was from the transporting, transferring, ordering. Somehow ordering came in quite a lot, and that moved into counting and sharing, but a lot in the garden. So, when you're in the garden and you're moving things from one place to another, when you're planting seeds into a line. Once the plant has grown, like the sunflower, for example, there was an example of the sunflower project where we're looking at lengths of flowers that again then related to the red rods and the colors and transferring. So yeah, it was a little bit of a disjointed yet cohesive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michelle and Jarek, may I invite you to share from your discussion, please?
I think Yarek's going to have to share because I was a naughty girl and I was a little bit late to my breakout room. So
but not so much, Michelle. And I think you've got a lot to say about that. Okay, so our conversation went in, I think, two directions. One was not very PC, I must say. And it was quite risky because we were talking about unconventional use of Montessori materials. And also we pointed out to the fact that perhaps these indirect objectives are far more important than we usually think they are. And also, also we thought about our openness to children doing with Montessori materials some things that were not intended, so to say. So it means that they use the materials in their own way. And from the perspective of Schema, and maybe we have a refreshing perspective on what the children can do with the material, actually. Not following the instruction and maybe not following precisely the presentation. That's why I say that this was it was a risky conversation, I would say. It was very vivid, but it was risky conversation, I must admit. Yeah, Michelle, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think we just sort of kept on talking around that subject, didn't we? And using lots of examples from practice. Everyone was using lots of examples from practice about how the children, how we could use the Montessori materials to scaffold the schemes, using that figurative knowledge and things, and then transferring it to outside. And there was some lovely stories coming from practice, which I love to hear. I think it just shows that, that it can all be used properly. And then, yeah, we talked a lot around the indirect objectives and the importance of those, and that maybe they've been lost along the way. Joanna came up with a lovely, I wrote it down, foregrounding the indirect objectives to create divergent use of the materials.
Yeah, versus the traditional use of the material, which was really nice because it turned out that we can be more traditional than we think within Montessori. And perhaps this, perspective, this Piagetian ideas of distinction may give us a different view on that. I mean, so this was very, very interesting, I must say.
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. Lynnette, it's wonderful to see that you have sparked so many divergent approaches to schemes and schemas. What about Sarah and Wendy?
Sarah, are you there?
I am, yes. Do you want me to talk, Wendy?
You might as well, because yes.
So we had a lovely conversation. I think one of the big things, Lynnette, is that most of us in the group know scheme and schema as just one word, and so beginning to identify the two different parts was good. Identifying schemes was something that was more straightforward, but the really thinking about how we would use that knowledge and really scaffold the child forward, you know, that was more of a we're seeing the transfer from indoors to outdoors, but not necessarily our step in supporting that forward, other than providing the freedom. And again, like you say, Michelle, some really beautiful examples. And although we didn't set out to have the divergent conversation, which seems to have happened elsewhere, what was explained was that children naturally were using these materials to satisfy their scheme and to explore schemas that they were interested in. One of the ideas for outdoors was about using pipes. So we looked at the red rods using pipes, and this idea of water moving and how children might organize that in different ways. And a lovely example from one of the South African in our group, looking at how providing very simple materials like boxes and things like that outdoors, and how many different ways children find to organize and position those, and how the scheme being used indoor could be used outdoors. What we all realized, and Mary brought forward very clearly, was that we need to observe very carefully, and we need to really use those observations to help us move forward. So it's looking in a slightly different way, understanding what the children do, but also understanding their scheme, their interest, because we can then use that as a motivation to be able to help them to move forward. And Mary put that very clearly for us.
Marion, would you like to feed from our group, please?
Yes, of course. It's always lovely to go last, because you can just sort of say, yes, lots of that happened in our group, and I can then bow my head and go back, but I won't. Lots and lots of discussion about how the first actions in that transferring activity that we looked at can be taken and then used in real life. You know, Barbara gave us a lovely image of her granddaughter with her yogurt, you know, spooning and eating, and using those skills that you've developed in the first activity that was on the shelf. We all have many of us have been trained in Montessori and would think that, you know, that's the way we can do it. But I think most of us have maybe taken that a little bit and possibly been a bit naughty or not PC, whatever you want to describe it, but using it in different ways. So we then went outside, you know, in the forest, at the beach. We talked about sand castles, of course, you know, transferring the sand into the bucket and making sand castles, and talked a lot about the independence, the concentration, of course, all those indirect objectives that fit so beautifully with that practical life area. One of the people in our group talked about pebbles and how those pebbles seem to move every day to have a new location, obviously being transported around it, and it's the observations of the children to show what is motivating them, so providing more of those materials for them. We talked about the importance of the maths with the sorting and matching that you get initiated by the colour box one. We also talked about how, I can't remember the name, I'm really sorry, Terry, I think it was. Terry was talking about South Africa, where there's been such horrendous fires, and how the children looked at the different colours that were being presented at the moment. So colour box one kind of led to the outside environment, where talking about grading blacks and greys, which aren't the most usual colours that we would encounter. And Barbara talked about the beautiful rain that we've had in the UK over the last couple of days that has made everything shades of green. So using those opportunities that are founded inside with the Montessori materials, but divergent thinking to actually take them outside and think of them in a slightly different way. And you can't discuss Montessori in my eyes without talking about sticks. Sticks come into play with so many different things that we do with the children. And one of the people in our group talked about the whole, the child going on a walk, picking up a stick. And of course, they always look for the next one, don't they? But then picking up that bigger one and realizing, actually, I'm not going to get very far with this one because it's too heavy. So enabling them to work out and to problem solve that they need to look for another smaller stick that was, more able or more capable of transporting. But I think key to all of what we said, even though we didn't quite mention it, is observation and how critical it is for us to follow the child's interest to actually enable them and see the environment to enable them to move forward. Barbara, have I missed anything?
Perfect recount. Thank you very much, Marion. I knew you would do it much better than I could. But I would just like to add one thing to the discussion, which you have all talked about a lot about indirect preparation, indirect aims or indirect objectives. But actually, the indirect preparation in Montessori classrooms is a perfect example of the emergent learning. And we should really value the activities of everyday living, and we should really value the sensorial activities because they plant the seeds for that juggling of the schemes and the understanding of the complexity of objects and everything that goes around it. And the interesting thing that came up in our discussion in Lynnette was the use of language. That is absolutely inherent part of, as the schemes become more complex, use of language is absolutely essential.
I'm so glad you picked up on that, and it wasn't time to do it today, but basically our language derives from our operational schemes. So if a child is a container, you'll hear them talking about in and out a lot. If they're a positioner, you'll hear them talking about where things go, behind, in front. Language comes from our operations, and therefore what we need to do is when we also see schemes observed, if we're really good, if you go onto the Schema Play Facebook, you'll find a whole load of books that relate to children's schemes. Read stories around those schemes because this is going to help them with their language development. It's been proven, linguistics, language derives from operations. Perhaps on another time we can look at that. It was too much today. But what's been so wonderful about what you've all just said is you're picking out the affordance of the materials. You're looking at the materials, and it was interesting to hear that some non-Montessorians on as well. The affordance of the materials, what does that material offer? What can we do with it? What is its use? And once you're able to think about what is a child doing with those materials. So you've already picked up some great things. I loved it. The red rods provide an opportunity for grading, and the transferring for seeding. Now you've thought about maybe a child that's done transferring and perhaps also engaging in grading, and they've probably done containing in AL. So they've got all the prerequisite schemes for planting. And you're talking about planting sunflowers. So we're using we've got the red rods, we can see different heights of them, and we can appreciate their different heights because we've engaged in grading with the red rods, which is helping our perception to see length. We could also make animal habitats, when they grade the sticks to make those sort of dens for habitats. Again, it's that same operation, sorting and grading in a different way. The matching with the color box materials, we can match all sorts of things. We do in the sensorial shelves, don't we? Why aren't we matching outdoors? Think about what are the invitations in the environment. So, Are there different leaves? Are there different shells that can be matched? Are there different stones that could be matched? What are the invitations in the environment? Just like all our Montessori materials have invitations, have affordances, things we can do with them, so does the natural environment. And when we're thinking about what children are using with their Montessori materials, whether they're transferring or whether they're grading or sorting or matching or grouping, how else can we facilitate that in other ways? Are we making bug hotels where children have to sort objects and group them? Because a bug hotel is irrelevant to introduce unless a child knows how to sort and match and group and knows what a shelter is, has a schema of a shelter. So we can really bring it together. It takes a while, but explore it over the coming weeks when you're looking at your Montessori materials and think, what are the schemes that the children are using and how can I enable them to apply them outside? And we can bring that whole cosmic education together, thinking about protection of wildlife, perhaps if we've got containers, making water catchers so we can see how much water's collected in a month like we've just had would be quite a lot. And we can really start to bring in new context for children using the schemes that they're so competently using with the Montessori materials. But thank you, that was fascinating feedback, and every one of them. And what I really took from that is some of you said the observations are key. And it is, but it's how in our profession, we've really got a big job to raise our profile. It's no good just to observe. We need to show how we're responding to our observations. So how are you responding? What are you doing about it when you see it? And that's the important question to always share with colleagues, I think.
Thank you so much, Lynnette, and thank you for reminding us about the sustainability agenda, because that is something that Montessori Europe aims to embrace in a big way as we go forward, as we go beyond our Congress in 10 days' time. And I would also, if you haven't registered yet, please join us. I hope that there will be lots of interesting conversations, and there will definitely be follow-up on embedded learning or embodied learning in the presentation by Laura Flores-Shaw. So until the Congress on the 21st or 22nd of May, and perhaps beyond, look out for our newsletters, and we look forward to joining you again soon. Thank you very much to the facilitators for keeping the conversations going. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening. Thank you.